Hello and welcome back to the latest devlog. Penumbra Tower is a grid-based roguelike where the player will have to navigate through the floors of the tower, defeating enemies and traveling farther within. If you've seen the previous devlogs, you're probably thinking, wow, this looks very different compared to the last video. And you would be right. We've got a lot of progress to cover in this devlog. So let's get started. I was thinking it's probably time we get rid of the placeholder tiles and create something less abstract. Something that feels more like our character is inside of a physical room, so I started working on this dungeon tile map. And as always, when I'm working on anything, I forget to record the majority of the time. So sadly, I didn't record creating the wall or the floor tiles, but I realized before I started the door tile, which arguably out of all the tiles, this one is probably the more interesting one. So with these tiles, and any sprite that I'm making, I'm trying to keep everything relatively simple. Here you can see me using the wall tile that I had already created as a background reference. I'm starting the door tile using this pen with the same stroke size that I use for every other sprite, and I start outlining the door frame. I'm going for this sort of front-facing view with a slight angle near the top of the door. I ended up redrawing the door frame multiple times until I thought I had the right angle, but after the recording, I went back and fixed it one last time. Next, I started painting the wall colors. I do this with the same pen, just at a larger size. And because this is a simple tile set, the wall is only going to have 3 or 4 shades of color to it. Mainly one primary shade with a highlight and a shadow. I also struggled a little bit trying to paint the angle of the door's path going into the next room, but I think it turned out okay. And here's what the final version of the door looks like. I find it always takes a little bit of massaging to get special tiles like this one to line up correctly with the rest of the tile set, but it looks pretty seamless in Unity now. I only made one variant of the floor tile to go with this door. What I did with the floor tile, in order to make it look different, was in the floor tile script, I randomized the angle of the tile when it's instantiated so it doesn't just look like a single tile repeating, because that never really looks good. There was also this whole thing I had to go through with the wall tiles where, if you remember the tiles from the last devlog, there actually was not any walls, it was just a grid. And because the room is being completely generated through the grid generation script, I needed to write a method that would wrap the grid in wall tiles and rotate the wall tiles depending on which side of the grid was being wrapped, and also detect whether or not the wall tile was a corner or not. This whole process was surprisingly more difficult than I thought it would be. You might be wondering, why not just place the tiles using the Unity tile map editor? And that's because each room of the tower is going to be completely randomized, which means both the type and placement of everything. This includes objects, enemies, hazard tiles, and the type of wall and floor tiles. You also may have noticed a couple of rocks around the room. I wrote this method in my unit manager script that randomly places obstacles around the room. The rock is more of just a placeholder for now, as it doesn't really match the dungeon room. Obstacles can also be destroyed by the player. Right now, the player can do that by simply attacking the obstacle, which does cost an action for that turn. They can also be leveraged to put distance between the player and enemies. And that's all I have for tile sets right now. You probably saw it in the opening clip for the video, or more likely the thumbnail, and you're probably thinking, what the heck is that? If you missed the previous devlog, which I think something may have happened to that devlog because after the 3rd day it just stopped getting impressions for some reason, a pretty unanimous decision was made in favor of the frog theme, and because of that I've been brainstorming a new enemy for you. Okay, so this is a fish, but more specifically, this is a pike, and this is obviously a man. But this man is a pike man, and this man is a pike man. Hopefully that all made sense. This also plays into what I've been doing with the enemy and player controller, but I'll get to that later. For now, we can talk about making the sprite, as I've actually remembered to record it this time. If you're interested in how I make these sprites, I do have a workflow walkthrough on my channel if you want to learn more. So, very similar to the wall tile, I started by redrawing the outline for the sprite a dozen times until I'm happy with it. I also did a sketch in a notebook just to get a general idea before I started working in Krita. After I finished the outline for the head, I started painting in the head with color. I'm focusing on the head a lot right now because the head, I think, is the most visually relevant part of the sprite in my opinion. The colors are also different in this version. I was going for this sort of green color with some dotted scale textures, but I moved away from the green because the frog is already green, and when I added the sprite to Unity, I thought the scales were an extra level of detail that did not match the other sprites, so I removed them. Here, I'm starting to give an outline to the body, trying to give him an idle stance for holding his little pike. I also gave him some nipples here. Those did not make it into the final version, sadly. And it's pretty much just rinse and repeat from here. I draw the outline for a body part, and then I fill it with color. I do group each body part into its own layers. That way it's very easy to move it into the sprite sheet when I need to. As I've said, this version of the pikeman and the version currently in the game looks slightly different. And the main reason for that is that this version that I showed in Krita I thought didn't really look like a fish. I thought I had accidentally made it look like another frog. And while the current version I think does look more like a fish, I don't really think it looks like a pike specifically, but oh well, a fish is a fish. Anyways, after those additional iterations, we now have this. Also, this is probably a good time to point out that I've made a slight update to the UI. Now, above the units' heads, it displays their health, damage, and actions for the turn, and you'll notice above the enemies, it doesn't display their movement pattern anymore. After struggling with movement behaviors for the last couple devlogs, I think I've found a happy little medium. So I'm feeling pretty good. In the previous devlog, I gave an overview of the card idea and also covered why it's not a good fit for this game. And the devlog before that one also covered enemy movement behaviors with rook, bishop, and queen archetypes. And actually now that I'm recording this, I don't know if I ever mentioned the queen movement before. It's pretty self-explanatory, same as chess, the unit would move diagonally and orthogonally. So going forward, both the enemies and player are going to not have their movement restricted to the behaviors. Now, what do I mean by that? The amount they are going to be able to move each turn is still going to be dictated by their total actions, but they're going to be free to move in any direction they want. So moving one tile will take one action and attacking will also take one action. This will also result in enemies now being able to attack multiple times each turn if possible, which they weren't able to before, but now this also applies to the player. The behavior patterns for enemies are still going to be in the game, but they are going to be tied directly to the enemy's attack pattern now, as opposed to how it was before where the behavior pattern was tied to both the movement and attack pattern. This also resolves an issue that I was running into but didn't cover in the previous devlogs, where enemies with the bishop behavior pattern were unable to attack the player if the player just stood on an adjacent tile. And just because I haven't really shown any code in this devlog yet, I did a ton of work on the enemy behavior script, mainly to do with its AI. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this yet, but I'm not using A-star pathfinding or any other public pathfinding library in this game. I'm doing all of this by myself because I like pain. So I've adapted my enemy behavior to also be able to detect if an object is blocking their path and find another path to reach the player. I've also added another behavior where if the enemy is in range of the player, but the player is not inside of their attack pattern, they will try to position themselves on a tile where the player is attackable and attack them from there. And yeah, more frog theme enemies and stuff coming soon. Let me know what you think of the pikeman. I could show you a lot more of the coding work that I did in the last 2 weeks, mainly to do with adapting the new movement system and disconnecting the card scripts from the last devlog, but it's 1 in the morning and I would like to have this devlog live tomorrow morning, so I'm just going, or I guess it's this morning, so I'm just going to leave it here. Hope you enjoyed this devlog, and I'll see you tomorrow, which I guess is today and which is also right now for you.